really appreciate everybody being here. It's a great audience. We've got a great panel here today. Make sure you're in the right room. We're here to discuss whether the American people should host a convention of the states. Before we get started, I do want to note for the lawyers in the room, first of all, I apologize. I'm one of those people who has that same status. If you're like me and every year you wait to your birth month and you scramble around looking for CLEs about 48 hours before they're due, this is a CLE accredited program, so sign up on a sheet of paper in the back so you can get your, 1.25 hours, get one knocked off. That's right. Look, we're truly blessed to have an really experienced and exceptional panel here today for this. I promise to say as little as possible. These guys are an all-star cast for public service and for warriors for liberty, and it really truly made me wonder what it is I've actually been doing with my life. We have State Representative Rick Miller. There we go. That's more like it. That's what we want to hear. Mr. Miller is serving his third term as representative for District 26 out of Sugar Land, right?
You bet. Sweet spot.
And following training, he was a designated these notes are missing, but you're a graduate of the Naval Academy. Is that right?
That's right.
And following school, he was a designated naval aviator and made numerous carrier deployments as a senior fellow on the Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Studies Group to develop innovative war fighting concepts for the 21st century Navy. Following transition from the Navy, he worked with several corporations as a senior consultant, VP and senior vice president focused on organizational and people improvement and development, integration of acquired companies, and training and human resource functions. He's the founder and president of Trevanian Group, LLC. And as I said, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a Master's of Science and National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of Armed Forces. First, just want to say thank you for your service. It means a lot to, I know, everybody in this room and to the people of Texas that you represent and across the state. So thank you.
You're welcome.
We also have, at the other end down here, Andy Oldham. He's a good friend. His greatest distinction, I think, is being a Wahoo, graduate of the University of Virginia, as am I. Mr. Jefferson's University, unfortunately, the faculty at the University of Virginia apparently don't like Mr. Jefferson enough to want to quote him, if anybody's seen the news on that. He's the Deputy General Counsel to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, previously served as Attorney General Abbott's Deputy Solicitor General. He clerked for Justice Sam Alito at the United States Supreme Court. He currently works on a wide range of appellate and constitutional issues. He's done a great deal of work in the Office of Legal Counsel at the United States Department of Justice and while in private practice in Washington, D.C. As I said, he's graduated at the University of Virginia and some school for law in Cambridge. I don't know what that was called. And finally, we have Mr. Mark Meckler, President of Citizens, founder and President, CEO, or numerous titles, of Citizens for Self-Governance and founder of the Convention of States Project. He was a co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots. He is a lawyer. I've known Mark now for a long time, dating back to Tea Party days and my time with Senator Cruz. But he is a warrior in the cause for self-governance and is instrumental in what we're going to talk about today with respect to the Convention of the States. And we're just delighted that he would take the time to come down here to Texas. I think it's fair to say, maybe an understatement actually, that this last election season was a change election on numerous levels. Obviously, we're a 501c3, so we won't get into the party politics of it all, but I think from an academic perspective, it is safe to say that it was a change election. The American people, at a minimum, were not happy and wanted something different. And but long before last year's elections, the American citizens were coming to the conclusion that something is terribly wrong. We saw this, as I referred to with Mark, with the Tea Party wave starting back in 2010, and on the heels of Obamacare, on the heels of the so-called stimulus package, so-called being the important part of that phrase. And we saw then a wave of senators like Mike Lee, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, and a whole bunch of people coming into Washington. And we saw some somewhat successful efforts to limit spending with a cut, cap, and balance approach in 2011. Where we ended up with the blunt instrument sequestration, but actually kind of held in check spending, and we saw some steps in the right direction, I think it'd be safe to say. But a critical question lies at the heart of what we're here to talk about today with the Convention of the States, and it's this. Can Washington really fix itself? Can Washington really fix the problems that we face? And, I think one thing to consider is that the father of the Constitution, James Madison, said, "We shall never find 2/3 of Congress voting or proposing anything which shall derogate from their own authority and importance." And I think that is a good place to start when we think about whether or not Washington is going to actually listen, maybe to take a phrase from my time with Senator Cruz as his chief of staff. One thing I was thinking about as we're getting ready to talk about this, I went to Washington for the first time in 2003 and worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Cornyn. Spent 5.5 years in Washington. In that time, came back, was a prosecutor for a little bit, worked for Governor Perry, and then went back to Washington. I went back to work for Senator Cruz as his chief of staff. From 2003 to now, 14 years, when I went there, the national debt was $6.7 trillion. Okay, now that's just the basic debt. It's not unfunded liabilities. It's not all the other things we know that are problematic. $6.7 trillion. Today it is 19.9 and closing in on 20. It's projected by CBO that the debt will be 26.3 trillion in 2020. You think about that. And we engaged in numerous fights. We engaged in battles that people thought were epic, like the defund fight, though, like I said, the cut, cap, and balance battle to hold spending in check, and all these huge fights so that debt could triple in 14 years from $6.7 trillion to $19.9 trillion. $19.9 trillion is $60,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. It's extraordinary. And you say, oh, well, this is all the Obama years, you say. Well, what about Reagan years? Well, Reagan years was $998 trillion in 1991 to, I'm sorry, 900, yeah, to 2000, to, yeah, 2.6, I'm sorry, 998 billion to 2.6 trillion in 1998. It almost tripled under the great Reagan years in the 1980s. And none of this, like I said, accounts for the unfunded liabilities, which, depending on how you count it, are in the 100 trillion plus range, depending on who you look to and count. But what about the administrative state, regulatory state? This unelected bureaucrats telling us what to do, whether we're talking about the Endangered Species Act, whether we're talking about the FCC, the FEC, the SEC, or any number of alphabet soup acronyms out of Washington telling us how to live. In 2003, the Code of Federal Regulations was 144,000. Today, it's 180,000. It's a 25% increase in the last, since I went to Washington the first time and since I left. In 1981, in the beginning of Reagan, it was 107,000. At the end of Reagan, you'd think, oh gosh, surely the Reagan administration, we slashed regulations. They'd gone up to 117,000 regulations. It's Washington. It's what they do. We have an out-of-control Supreme Court. And I can go down the list of cases we can all go through. It could be the Kelo case, where suddenly your house is a public use project in the eyes of the government. It's taken, and the Supreme Court says, sure, no problem, in a 5-4 opinion, that's okay. It could be fair housing case. We're in Texas, where we've got laws where we're trying to do what we think is right and how we have our housing laws in Dallas. And then you've got Anthony Kennedy saying, no, sorry, there's a discriminatory effect in whatever way he decides to define that. It could be the Obamacare case, where the Supreme Court decides to save Obamacare by deciding something is a tax, which decidedly was not. It could be social issues, definition of marriage. It could be any number of issues where you find the Supreme Court deciding how we should live. Executive orders. This current Texas Attorney General has sued the President of the United States and the administration, the federal government, 21 times. Now that's behind how many, Andy? How many?
We say over 30.
Over 30 times that our current governor and former Attorney General Abbott sued the federal government. Now hopefully with the new administration that'll slow down. But why, right? Well, we're talking about everything from executive amnesty to Obamacare taxes and regulations to blocking regional haze laws by the Environmental Protection Agency, the bathroom policies that we've been hearing a lot about. All of these things that are much more about not necessarily the underlying substance than it is about the federal government telling us what we should do and how we should live. And frankly, in this case, doing so through unilateral action by the president that is not either constitutional or lawful under our laws and the Administrative Procedures Act. And what we've found is we've had federal judges that are agreeing with us. We're winning these cases in the courts. And this is a good thing that we're winning these, but it's a bad thing that we're having to even have these battles in the first place. And it's an example of what's going on in Washington, both horizontally, separation of powers and what the president does, and vertically, what's happening between Washington and the states in terms of federalism and our ability to manage ourselves. So what do we do about all this? Oh, Washington will fix it. We got a new administration. Let's go. I don't think so. This is why we're here. We're talking about a convention of the states, that we believe that there are certain structural problems that we've been observing for a long time now that ought to be addressed. and that the citizens of the United States have the opportunity to do that, to fix it, to fix the problem. And that importantly, the Founding Fathers gave them a purposeful, specific tool in the Constitution to do that. So what I'd like to do is turn over to this group, stop listening to me, with a few questions, and then we'll go through this, and we're going to talk for about maybe 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, and then have a Q&A session with you guys, ask some questions, and happy to talk about them. But I'll throw out to the group, first of all, and you know, we can just hop around the panel, y'all jump in. What is a convention of states, and why do we need it? Let's start with that. You guys jump in.
So I'll give it to you from the layman's perspective, because I'm a grassroots activist, what I do, and our organization is promoting a convention of states. The power to call a convention of states is a unique power found in the second clause of Article 5 in the United States Constitution, and it's given a power to state legislators that is a power like nobody else in the United States of America has. It's really extraordinary how much faith and how important the founders thought that state legislators were, because state legislatures have the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and then to ratify amendments to the United States Constitution. There's literally no other branch of government that has this power, no other individuals in the legislatures, in executive positions in the United States of America that have this power. So it's an extraordinary power granted to state legislatures by the founders. The history of how it came to be kind of tells you what it's all about. September 15, 1787 is an incredibly important day in American history. I would say for me, first of all, September 15th, the most important day in history, because it's my wife's birthday, and if I forget it, I'm in a lot of trouble, right? It's also important because it's what we call Article 5 Day. On September 15, 1787, Colonel George Mason from Virginia stands to address the convention, the original constitutional convention. It's 2 days before the end of the convention, and he says we have a fundamental problem with the document we've drafted. We've given the power to Congress to propose amendments should they deem them necessary, but we failed to give that same power to the people acting through the states. And he asks the men assembled a question. He says, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government which becomes a tyranny will propose appropriate amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Now, we don't have video from that day, but I'm sure if we did, there would be laughter among the men assembled. No tyranny has ever restrained its own power. The men assembled there understood this so well that Madison's notes reflect there was no debate. They debated everything. There was no debate on this issue, and it was unanimously agreed to put the second clause of Article 5 in, giving the states the power, and remember what they were discussing, specifically to restrain federal tyranny. So this is an opportunity for the states to get together. And then what is it? This is really important. To get into convention, to have a discussion. That's all they do in convention. And then they make some suggestions to the states. So I call it to get together for a suggesting convention, to have a meeting. And then they're going to make suggestions to the states of what they think they should do to rebalance the power relationship between the states and the federal government in a more appropriate way. And then it's up to the states, a supermajority, 3/4 of the states, to decide whether they like those suggestions or not. So that's kind of the basic summary of the process.
One quick question, maybe Andy, you can jump in here, or Mark. I think this is instructive. The first state to use that second provision in the Article 5 to call for a convention of the states, what state was that, and why did they do it?
Well, it depends a little bit on how you define the first suggestion. I mean,
Yep.
when the Constitution that Mark was mentioning was passed out of the original Constitutional Convention in 1787 and it went to the states for ratification, there were several states that actually proposed or suggested additional amendments, which eventually became the Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments to the Constitution, in their ratification conventions at the time, in the 1780s, the late 1780s. And there were...
You just need to slide it closer to you.
Is that better?
Yep.
So I was saying that when the original Constitution was ratified in the late 1780s, between 1787 and 1789, several of the states, in their discussions of ratifying the original Constitution, proposed amendments. And those amendments, some of them, eventually ended up as the Bill of Rights. And so several of those states, New York was one, Massachusetts was one, North Carolina was one. There were several states that did it that way. So if you count that as the sort of original use of Article 5, it literally dates back to the ratification of the Constitution itself.
And I think that's really critically important, right? That we're talking about the Bill of Rights, right? When people talk about the Convention of the States as being something that's kind of maybe a little out in left field or hard to grasp, its first use was to apply pressure to Congress to actually honor the commitment by Madison in talking about the Bill of Rights, and that they would actually execute on that. It was states taking action to say, you're going to go do the Bill of Rights, and taking steps to do that. I think an important question to talk about right now, and this might be for either Representative Miller, who is the sponsor of the Convention of States legislation in the Texas legislature, or Andy in the governor's office, to talk a little bit about what would we want to accomplish with a Convention of the States. What are the kinds of things that we would seek to do? Why is it important to Texas?
Okay. I'll be happy to. Thank you, Chip. And it's an honor to be here with all of you, but also with my two colleagues here. I've worked with both of them. They're really just terrific people. Yeah. So I'm a veteran. Long time ago, I took the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I think we've got some enemies here, right? And maybe not enemies, but people who are not doing their job. And so, how many of you out there are fed up with the way the federal government's worked? Okay, most of you, not all of you? Wow, that's good. Well, I am too. And so, when this came to me last session, and I was really honored to be asked to do this last session, I said, are you kidding me? This is great. And so I willingly took that on and fought hard for it last session. We got it through the House. We didn't get it through the Senate, maybe because of timing or whatever. But by gosh, we're going to get it done this time. And we need to get it done, right?
Right.
Right, okay. So, if you look back in the history of Texas, I believe the first time the Texas legislature passed anything like this was in 1895. Can you believe that? That's right, isn't it? Yeah. So Texans did realize that, the federal government does need to be tapped here and say, hey, look, we the people, we the states. And I was having a conversation with somebody before it came in. He said, there are really, how many branches of government are in the Constitution? Like 3? 4? 5? Okay. So we know about the usual ones, right? And so, but what about we the people? Are we a branch of that? Yeah. What about the states? The state's a branch of that? So absolutely, and so it's now time for the states to stand up and be counted in this whole debate and this whole question, because we've got to right the ship. I'm a war fighter, okay, and so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to war fight. I'm going to be a fighter for this because I serve my country. I now serve the great state of Texas, and I believe in my country. But by gosh, we've got to right the ship, and so I'm just as upset with Republicans as I am with Democrats. Okay. So, and trust me, we have a good bunch of us here in Texas who are going to stand up for this, and we're going to make it happen this time. We need this. We're going to fight for it, and we're going to get it done this time.
Andy, you think you might add a little bit, and a little backdrop here, a little backdrop of the governor's plan, which was announced about a year ago right now?
That's right, at a TPF event, in fact. Sure. So the governor last January proposed what we call the Texas Plan. And it was 9 particular amendments that the governor would like to see proposed at, as Mark puts it, the suggesting convention. So, the idea is that the states would get together to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. And sometimes when you talk to folks about some of this stuff, and you talk about the original, the foundation of this country in the 1780s, it can seem a little bit ephemeral, and it can seem a little bit theoretical, and a little bit nerdy and difficult to understand. And so and so one of the governor's ideas was to say, well, let's give some very specific examples of the kind of thing that we want to see accomplished. And as Chip pointed out at the beginning of this session, all 3 branches, I should say the first 3 branches of the federal government, both Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary, have systematic flaws. And so the governor proposed particular amendments that would address all 3 branches of the federal government and those flaws. To just take a couple of examples, the executive branch, as Chip pointed out, has largely taken over the obligations and the responsibilities of writing federal law. Over 90% of the law that comes out of Washington, D.C. is in the Code of Federal Regulations that Chip mentioned. It's not in the United States Code. It's never voted on by a member of Congress. It's never signed into law by the president. It is literally just the dictates of bureaucrats in Washington. And that is unacceptable. And so the governor has proposed a plan that would come out of this suggesting convention that would make all of those administrative regulations completely inoperable as a matter of law unless and until they're voted on by elected members of Congress. Congress likewise has abdicated its constitutional responsibility. When the founders, Mark speaks very eloquently, and I've been honored to share stages with him many times, and he speaks very eloquently about what those men in Philadelphia did in 1787 when they were coming up with the design of a federal government. And they were very, very clear that the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8 would serve as a constraint on what the federal government would do, and everything else would be left to the states, people like Representative Miller and his colleagues in the Capitol. And what has happened in this country is largely Congress has arrogated to itself and abdicated the constraints in Article 1, Section 8, has arrogated to itself all sorts of powers, perhaps the most egregious of which is the Commerce Clause. So now, instead of regulating just interstate commerce, which the founders understood to mean basically trade, boats and what would later become trains and stuff like that, what they now do is regulate virtually every commercial activity in the United States, including stuff that would never qualify as trade, like Chip mentioned, the Endangered Species Act, and certainly things that aren't interstate trade. Like wholly intrastate activity can be regulated and is regulated by the federal government. So one of the governor's proposals is to restore the Commerce Clause to its original meaning. And then the last example I'll give you is on the judicial branch. Folks, one of the things that, and I know Mark has heard this, I'm sure Representative Miller has heard it, when we go around and we talk about the Convention of States, one of the responses is, oh, goodness, why do we need to do this? Why should we amend the Constitution? And the supposition of the concern seems to be that if we don't have a Convention of States, that somehow the Constitution will remain static, or it will remain the same, or it's the same document that we had basically ratified in the 1780s, and that's just not true. It's amended every June when the Supreme Court of the United States adjourns. They issue a bevy of opinions that effectively glom on all sorts of new rights and erase other rights that the Constitution is either supposed to protect or not supposed to protect, and it's just the whim of 5 unelected lawyers who happen to wear black robes. And so the last sort of set of proposals from the governor is on the judicial branch. And it is to say when the Supreme Court of the United States issues constitutional rulings that have the effect of effectively reconstruing the document that was ratified by the founders, that decision is itself accountable to the states, so that the states can gather and say, no, actually, we don't think that that's what the First Amendment means, or the Fifth Amendment means, or the 14th Amendment means. And that, too, would restore the document that we hold so sacred and dear to we, the people.
Hey, Chip, can I add one thing to that?
Please.
One of the things that Andy brought up that I think is so important is you will hear people say, if we could just get them to follow the Constitution, everything would be fine. And it's really important we know what that means, right? So there are probably a bunch of people in this room that have a pocket Constitution on them. Great document, it's about this big, it's about that thick, right? That's not our Constitution. I hate to break this to you. People who think that's our Constitution live in a fantasy world of unicorns and rainbows, right? Our Constitution, I ordered one recently. I have it on my desk at home. It is called the Annotated Constitution. Order it from the government printing office. It's the only place you can get it. It's over $200. It's 2,738 pages, right? And you literally cannot lift it with one hand. It's like this. It's just gigantic. That is your Constitution. So when people say we just need to protect the one we have, I'm telling you, that's the one that has Obamacare in it. That's the one that has these Commerce Clause interpretations in it. That's the one that has all these radical social issues decisions in it that you don't like. So when people say to you, just follow the Constitution, that's what they're saying. So that distinction is really important.
It is.
Mark, I'm glad you made that distinction. Having lived the world in the Senate Judiciary Committee and then as Senator Cruz's Chief of Staff in Washington, that is the best example you can give when people start saying, well, gosh, we don't want to touch the 4 corners of the Constitution. Well, look, I agree. I would rather not touch the 4 corners of the Constitution as the founders gave it to us. But the four corners of what we're talking about is that monstrosity that he's describing. And that, I'm telling you, I've got that book. I've got it at home, and it's heavy. It's huge. And that's actually at the heart of the problem. This brings another issue. I want to throw a question out about why the Convention of the States resolution, as we're currently seeing it, and as Representative Miller has introduced it in the Texas legislature, which has sort of three, and I'll let Representative Miller describe it in more detail, but it has, you know, three major prongs, right? Fiscal restraint, term limits, and then what you would call the, I don't know how we refer to the restriction of power in Washington.
Scope of jurisdiction.
Yeah, scope of jurisdiction, pulling back power from Washington. I bring that up because I think there's a lot of energy behind the notions of, say, balancing the budget or putting limits term limits on our representative members in Congress and the Senate. And those generally poll very highly, as you would expect. They're fairly populist. That third prong, this prong about restricting the power in Washington and reinforcing that constitutional notion of where the power is located in the states and the people, what the 10th Amendment essentially restates, the magic of the Constitution, right? That's where the power is located. That third prong, that's where the action is, okay? It's not to say that we don't need fiscal restraint and a balanced budget. It's not to say that we don't need term limits. This whole effort is to talk about those three things. But that third component is where the action is. So I'd like to see if I can throw to Representative Miller, who's introduced the legislation, or Mark or Andy, to expound on that a little bit about why the Convention of the States resolution as we've currently got it packaged.
Okay, I'll address it from the resolution itself. If anybody wants to see it, they come up afterwards. This is my HJR 39. That's the number of it. The Senate companion of that, filed by Senator Birdwell, is SJR 2 in the Senate. And so both of those are pretty high numbers, which gives us a little bit, maybe a priority. But anyway, the resolution, and as I laid it out last time, and we'll lay it out this time, we cannot change anything, any wording in this resolution, because 34 states must send this same resolution, this petition to Congress, the same thing, which then forces the trigger. It's the trigger that forces the Convention of States to be held. So it's the three broad areas: fiscal, regulatory restraint, and term limits. Those are the three broad areas. No specific amendments in here. Well, glad to see what the governor did and came out last year in supporting this. Matter of fact, if he would be my first witness when I lay this out in committee, I'd really appreciate it. But
You'll commit him to that here, right?
but I don't know. I think he'll be helping us out, making this a priority for the legislative session, since he's written a book about it. But and the Texas plan. How many of you read the Texas plan? Okay, if you haven't, read the Texas plan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
right there. I mean, he lays it out very clearly what this is all about. So the resolution is here. If you want to see it, but 34 states must pass exactly the same resolution in words. And so those are the three broad areas. Many of my colleagues are familiar with it because they heard it last time. Matter of fact, we're just sending letters out to all of my colleagues, individual letters signed by me saying, this is what we're doing. Go sign in as a co-author of this resolution as soon as possible. And so we'll see where that goes.
Hey, Mark, has this ever happened before where we've had a concerted effort for the exact same language at a national level to work this through legislatures?
No. I mean, this is literally a first ever. Our organization has organizations on the ground in all 50 states. We've got the budget to back it. There's a national staff. There are volunteer directors at the state level. There are legislative liaisons in every state. We've got some of those folks in the back of the room here for Texas. It's never been done before. Today, something miraculous happened in the last few months. We hit the point where we have volunteers in 100% of all state legislative districts in the United States of America. So it's a pretty extraordinary effort. You know, and Chip, to address your question about, why the action is in sort of this scope and jurisdictional restraints, why that's so important. One of the things I can do is go to Jefferson as an example. Thomas Jefferson, when asked about the government providing educational services to the citizens, said, well, we could do that, but it would require a constitutional amendment. And I challenge you to look in the Constitution anywhere and find that amendment. It doesn't exist. But we all know the federal government is deeply involved in education in the United States of America. And part of the reason for that is, believe it or not, the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Because, of course, education is business. I'm not exactly sure how they got there, right? It's pretty twisted and convoluted, and that's how they got there. In fact, under current interpretations of the Commerce Clause, not doing business is commerce. Right? I mean, it's really extraordinary what we've come to. So when we're talking about this area, I like to say the amendment that I want to see is what I call the "no, really, we meant it the first time" amendment, right? So that's really what we're talking about is the founders actually did a pretty darn good job of setting forth the enumerated powers and saying that everything else belongs to the states and the people, right? They did a good job. They didn't make a mistake. It's just those powers have been usurped by all three branches of government, aided by a complicit and sometimes very aggressive federal court system all the way up to the Supreme Court. So in reigning in the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, we're doing what the founders did in the first place. We're putting the teeth back in the Constitution, and there are many areas where we can do it. Education, commerce, energy, all of those things operate under the Commerce Clause as currently interpreted, but not as drafted.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the Jefferson example. As a University of Virginia graduate, I'll take a couple seconds to talk about Mr. Jefferson. Andy can jump in here. You may know that on his tombstone, right, he wanted to be remembered for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. As he retired to Monticello, the hills of central Virginia, he had a vision for the University of Virginia, got it created and so forth. On the back of his idea of the public diffusion of knowledge being central to a healthy democracy. And this was central to his thinking. This was a passion for him, right? He was a president. He was a governor. He was a secretary of state. He was a vice president. He didn't, lack for credentials to put on his tombstone and be remembered. This was a passion education. Yet, somebody passionate about that, with the power that he had to try to influence things, recognized that it should be a constitutional amendment in order to say that this should be a national initiative or a national effort. It was inherently local. It was inherently a responsibility of the state and of the people. And this is so critical that we recognize the perspective that the founders had when they were looking at things that they were passionate about, things that they thought were important to the citizenry as a whole, but that they knew that distributed government and that federalism and that the separation of powers were all critical to the maintenance of our democracy. I think it would be useful for us to talk a little bit about this effort in light of the change election, right? It may be easy to talk about, oh, we need a convention of the states. What's going on in Washington, in November 5th? Is it still the same? Is it still necessary? And if so, why? Gentlemen.
Well, I can address it from a national grassroots perspective. I've been in 40 states in the last 2 years. I have a pretty good feel for the pulse of the people. And there are some people, because of this change election, that are saying, look, President-elect Trump and the new Congress, they're going to change everything, so maybe we don't need to do this. Y'all know who Jeff Foxworthy is? And Foxworthy has a saying, sometimes he'll do this routine where he says, and if you do blank, you might be a redneck, right? And so what I say, with all due respect to the incoming Trump administration, which I'm looking forward to seeing what they do, is there's some things that if you believe, you might just be Trump drunk. And these are the things. One is, if you believe that this Congress, which is the exact same Congress we had before the election, by the way, is somehow suddenly going to grow a spine, you might just be Trump drunk, right? Let's remember Paul Ryan is the Speaker of the House. This is the same man that bravely stood up and defunded Obamacare in the Oh, wait, never mind. I dreamed that one night. Yeah, I dreamed that. In the Senate, we got the same leader, got Mitch McConnell leading the Senate. This is the same guy that stood strong against illegal executive amnesty and, oh, no, wait, I dreamt that also. So this is the same Congress. So the idea that Congress is suddenly somehow going to be brave and do all this wonderful, incredible, limited government stuff, if you believe that, you might be Trump drunk. Here's the second step. Let's say I'm wrong. Maybe Congress gets incredible stuff done and it comes out. It's going to come out. It's going to be immediately challenged by every single leftist lawyer on the planet. And it's going to go into a federal court system. Thank God that court system is populated only with conservative originalist jurists who believe in limited powers for the federal government. And in fact, some of them are going to make their way all the way to the Supreme Court, where we know, thank God, we have Chief Justice John Roberts, who is always going to do the right thing. Oh, wait, I dreamed that one also.
Where'd you get that?
I don't know. I'm delusional, right? So this stuff's going to get tied up in the federal courts, even if it's great, right? And here's the bottom line. This is an important number, 1.35 million federal employees. All of them, except for I think there are 3 guys that are already slated for retirement, are going to stand against everything the administration wants to do. And that's not because they're bad people, it's because it's human nature. Because what we want to see is a shrinking of the federal government. What they see when we say that is loss of jobs. Those are their families, those are their futures, those are their retirements. 1.35 million federal employees are going to stand against the kind of limited government changes we want to see. So if people believe that everything's going to change, they might be Trump drunk, and they might want to look back, as Chip pointed out, at the Reagan administration.
Can I add to that?
Please, Representative.
Okay, you know, words are important. There's no question about that. We've heard words. My wife, now I have just got remarried, but my wife keeps telling me, you know, your words are important, Rick, but it's time to act. It's time to do. And that's where we are. It's time to act. And I believe that the states put the federal government in place. Is that not right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we, the states, need to stand up and take control of this. And so that's why, if not Texas, who? Right? Not Texas, who? So is there still a need to do this with the Trump administration? Absolutely. We've heard great words. We see some pretty good people being maybe put in place, but I don't have any confidence that they're going to do the right things yet. I haven't seen anything. But we can do this. We can stand up and we can put this in place, and we can lead the nation. Texas can lead the nation, and I think other states will fall in line once Texas does that. That's what I believe. So it's time for us to act.
One question that I have for the panel is, why is this a priority in Texas specifically? And Andy, you might be able to start with that. This is obviously a high priority for the governor. And we've got a lot of things that we need to do in Texas, and we're focusing on that are Texas-centric, and whether it's education reform or whether it's good on the list of things that we know are big deals in Texas in this legislative session that's kicking off. Why is this such a high priority, and what will it mean for Texas? And I might add, just a side note, I don't believe it's an accident that it's Representative Miller and Senator Birdwell who are carrying this legislation to veterans, to men who understand what it means to sacrifice for the country. Representative Miller, a longtime veteran, and obviously Senator Birdwell, I think most people know his story. If you don't know Senator Birdwell's story, I'd highly recommend Googling it. And he did a fantastic video. And if you haven't seen it, I definitively recommend you watch it with your kids, watch it with your family, about what he went through at the Pentagon. I bring all that up to say these are men who understand what it means to be an American, right? As a representative in our armed forces, this isn't some sort of fractious, like let's break apart. This is Texas. These are people who love our country, right? I mean, and have literally bled for our country. And so I don't think it's an accident that there are these two gentlemen that are carrying the legislation. And so I'd ask both the representative and Andy in particular, why is this so important for Texas?
Sure, I can speak a little to from the governor's perspective. You know, one of the things that Governor Abbott learned in his long tenure as the Attorney General of this wonderful state is that lawsuits are really, really important. And he brought his fair share, as Jim mentioned, and won a lot of them. But one of the things you learn when you bring these lawsuits is that each one is kind of a discrete thing. You know, we're having a specific and concrete fight over a small issue, which only exposes the much broader illness, right? That it's not just one executive regulation that just happens to be unlawful. It's issued from an administrative state that is, to its core, illegitimate, right? In the sense that it is not supposed to be creating laws unilaterally, simply by the whim of bureaucrat. And I think now that Governor Abbott is in the governor's office, and those of us who moved from the Attorney General's office to the governor's office have seen this in a particular way, you realize just how many connections we have from the state government to the federal government, and just how many times there are things that are important to the people of this great state, to the 30 million people who make up this wonderful, wonderful place, where we have priorities, we have mandates from voters, we, the people, want something done, and for whatever reason, sometimes it's a federal statute, sometimes it's a federal bureaucrat, sometimes it's an existing regulation, sometimes it's a new regulation, sometimes it's a wayward district judge. For any number of reasons, we, the people, don't get to do the thing that our voters send us into office to do, right? And that is a really big problem. And you realize the longer that you sort of study it and the longer you study the connections between the state governments and the federal government, just how many times there are things that are true priorities. And we could go through, I mean, we could sit here and have an entire policy orientation just about those connections between the state government and the federal government. It is literally every single agency, every one of the alphabet soups agencies that Chip mentioned outside of this panel is connected in some way to the states and can control what the states want to do and can control what the voters of those states send their office holders into office to do. And so the reason it's such a priority and the reason that it is such an important thing for the state of Texas is that it is just time for we the people, we the state of Texas, to be able to determine what it is exactly how we want to live, right? To take that power back and to stop having it dictated to us from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, personally, obviously what you said about me is absolutely true. I served 30 years in the Navy. I was a naval aviator. I was willing to give my life for my country. I still am today. I lived that same oath I took when I became a midshipman at the Naval Academy. That's important to me because I believe in my country, and I'll do anything that I can to keep it alive and well. And so many of you out there have served as well, I think, and so I'm sure you feel the same way. And so, and Senator Birdwell and I are working hard on this together. We both believe in what we're doing, and we believe very strongly in that. Texas leads the nation in so many areas. Oh my gosh, think about it. We're the 11th largest economy in the world. And so, so we need to lead. It's important to me as a Texan now. I got here as soon as I could. It took me a while, but I got here. But I'm a proud Texan, and as I am a proud American. And so we're going to lead this effort. It's important to Texas to lead. And with Governor Abbott strongly behind us, we're not going to fail, okay? I know he looked at me in the eye a couple times last session, and I said, okay, I got it, Governor. So, but anyway, and our 100, I don't know how many now, but 100,000 plus patriots that we have in Texas, I mean, that's great. So, and we have a good feel who's with us and who's not, right, in the legislature. And so we're working on those people, but Texas must lead. We must lead.
Hey, Chip, to give you the national perspective, you know, I'm not from Texas, but I wish I were. I travel all over the country, and I can tell you it is, I know Texans think they're really important, but I can tell you actually other states look at you. This is just a fact, especially when you deal with the South and the Midwest and even the mountain states. And I hear from other states, well, why hasn't Texas passed this yet? You know, maybe we should sit back, great conservative state with great patriots like Texas, maybe we should sit back and wait because the Texans haven't done it yet. So it's incredibly important that Texas leads, not just for Texas, but for the whole country. And remember, look, if the whole country fails, Texas is still tied to the country. It's a problem. You know, the whole country needs to survive together, and Texas needs to lead the way. Chip, you guys probably know the numbers better than I do. On average in the states, 60 to 65% of a state budget is mandated spending by the federal government. So if you think about that, when you send great guys like Rick Miller to the legislature, what they're arguing about how to spend the money is roughly 35% of the money that you guys give them to spend. That's just outrageous. We got to fix that.
There's no question. Editorial comment for a minute. I had the privilege of being the first assistant attorney general for a year and almost a half, about 16 months for Attorney General Paxton. And to Andy's point, we running into a buzzsaw repeatedly whenever you would want to make a policy change or make a decision, but you kept hitting some restriction that was coming from Washington, right? We had to try to fix some computer systems. We got to go through 50 hoops to go figure out how to deal with it because there's federal dollars attached to it. 2/3 of the Attorney General's budget comes from Washington. 2/3. Why? Well, child support's a big piece of that, and that's a whole other conversation. But you're beholden to whatever they're telling you to do in order to figure out how to navigate and manage the budget in the Attorney General's office. These are things that are dotted throughout all of the agencies and all of the inner workings of government in Texas. So I could definitively think that's a critical point. I think before we get to Q&A, we've got maybe about another 5 or 10 minutes. I think it would be helpful to get a little bit of a status update on where things stand nationally. Mark, you might be able to do that the best. And then in addition, maybe address the concern of, I think maybe one of the main concerns for especially a conservative audience like this, of a runaway convention, and what some people raise as a fundamental question about that. So,
Sure. So, quick status report is there are 8 states that have passed already identical Convention of States resolutions. So there are 8 in the bank. You have to get to 34 states. I believe this week, I don't have the latest number, it might have changed in the last couple of days, 13? 14 states have now pre-filed their resolutions for the coming session. By the end of the next week, we expect that to be up to 27. Ultimately, roughly 37 states will file the resolution in the coming session. We will be active in every single one of those states. The surprising thing for me, Chip, this year is the number of states that have prioritized it. Representative Miller talked about the high bill numbers or low bill numbers indicating priority. Texas has done that. I found out Missouri has done it. Utah has done it. I just heard Arkansas has done it. Some of these places, in Texas, we were talking about it. We have a much more sophisticated operation here, lots of great support. So that was something we worked on. In these other states, we didn't work on that. The states are just prioritizing it. So what we see is this incredible increased momentum. We see a lot of public figures coming on board. Governor Abbott came on board, of course, last January, kind of leading the way. Senator Tom Coburn works for us. But we get calls from public figures all the time asking to come on board. And those people are from the far right and very, very conservative people to very moderate people, which is really extraordinary to me. We got a call not too long ago. We've made this announcement. We've got some literature on it. Governor Bush from Florida called us up and said, look, we got to fix the country. You guys are the only way. So he's another guy that's on board. So whatever your political perspective, it's amazing to see people across the spectrum coming on board. As we said, we recently crossed the threshold, volunteers in every state legislative district, 2.1 million volunteers in the field all around the country. So the movement is hot, moving, and we expect to see great accomplishments this season.
Great. Do you mind, Andy, jump in
Sure.
on that point and then addressing the runaway convention arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark's gotten the status report. I'm happy to do a little bit on the runaway convention concern. This is one of the things that I know all three of us have heard when we go and do talks like this and do panels and speeches, is there's often this concern that, well, goodness, if we put folks, if we convene this convention, the suggestion convention that Marcus called it, and we get these folks into a room, they're going to do crazy stuff. They're going to, repeal the right to religious freedom that's ensconced in the First Amendment, or they're going to repeal the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. I've even heard the suggestion that, folks are going to get together and they're going to reinstate slavery, as if that is somehow a realistic possibility.
Really?
And there are a lot of ways to respond to this. And again, we could talk for an hour and a half just about the reasons why this concern, I think, is not well founded. One of the reasons that it's not well founded is that the convention itself can be limited. The convention that Representative Miller has introduced has 3 very specific subject matters, none of which is changing the right to religious freedom, for example, or the right to free speech. So at such a convention, there would be no opportunity to propose such amendments. There's also, we have in the state of Texas, we've proposed, and in other states they already have in law, particular provisions that control the delegates, so that the delegates or the commissioners who go to these conventions have to obey the call of the convention. And if they are wayward in the way that they behave at the convention, there are all sorts of penalties. Some states have imposed criminal penalties on their delegates that would get up and say, we should do this crazy idea or that other crazy idea that's outside of the context of the call for the convention. But perhaps the best response to the runaway convention idea and the runaway convention concern is Article 5 itself. Article 5 itself has enormous supermajority requirements. As Marcus pointed out, it takes 34 states to passing a resolution to call the convention. When the convention proposes those amendments, they come back to the states for ratification, and it takes 38 states to ratify. So if we've gotten to a place in this country where we cannot count on 13 states to stop an improvident suggestion, then things really are bad. In fact, they're much worse than I think any of the 4 of us would even suggest at this point.
Yeah, and I'm going to flip that math on its head because I like smaller numbers because I'm simpler than Andy. There's 38 states required to ratify, 13 states can stop anything, and generally 1 house in each of 13 states because likely the ratification method will be by the state legislature. So I want you to think about this, okay? What you have to believe, this is important. When people say runaway, I say if you say runaway, this is in your head and you cannot deny this. This is really important. If you think that they're going to take away our Second Amendment rights and you say it's because it'll run away, then you believe this. You believe that Texas and North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama and South Carolina and North Dakota, Wyoming, I mean, name it. You believe that all those states are going to vote to take away your firearms. And I say, that's crazy.
Yeah, just real quickly, add a little bit to it. Yeah, I look at it simplistically, and maybe I shouldn't, but 13 legislative bodies of 99 in our country have to say no. 13 of 99, right? Mm-hmm. So, just like Mark said, and Andy said, nothing like that's going to happen, okay? Nothing. So, I just attended recently a mock convention of the states. Can I talk about this?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So there were 4 of us from Texas. And I remember we had
By
split.
the way, we made an exception for Texas. You're the only delegation with 4.
I know,
so
I
I'm
know.
just saying.
If not Texas, who? Anyway, so we were split into 3 panels or 3 committees to talk about those 3 broad areas and come up with amendments. We were limited to the number of amendments. 5 amendments came out, or I think 8 or
A total out
eight,
of the committees?
8 came out of the committees, I think,
Yeah,
or
8.
7, but we approved 5. In our plenary session, we all voted for 5. 2 of those were from Texas, by the way. One was the one I was kind of voicing and carrying, was repealing the 16th Amendment. You know what that is?
Income tax.
Right, so that was an interesting debate. But the point is that, and I remember one discussion, there was a state, I won't tell you which state it was, sitting in front of us, and one of the delegates there turned around and said, "Hey, can I be from Texas?" So, anyway.
We all want to be from Texas.
Which was really kind of neat. But so we went through that mock convention, and we kind of proved to ourselves that, and there were some Democrats there, by the way, at that convention. And so we proved that in just a limited 2-day period, this real convention of states would probably take, I don't know, months or however long,
yeah.
right? But we proved there that we can do this. We had great debate. We talked about the 5 amendments that we actually approved from that mock convention. So this process works. 13 states, 13 legislative bodies need to say no to anything that's bad.
Yeah, one last
So
thing on that
if I-
13, Chip.
Well,
real
I was
quick.
about to,
Okay.
I was going to jump in and mark
Okay, no,
it,
go.
that it's actually 13 just don't have to act.
I think
right?
that's the-
So if 13 houses of, it's not even but the whole body, right, in a bicameral legislature, if 13 houses don't act in the limited time period that is given in whatever the amendment period, ratification period is, then it won't happen.
And we always say, what are legislatures best at doing? Nothing, right?
Well,
I mean,
I-
politically, it's the easiest thing to do, is all I'm saying, right?
I wish
So-
they were better at doing
Yeah,
nothing,
but
but
if you
whatever.
get a controversial issue, the easiest thing is to table it and do nothing.
I think now we've eaten a little bit into the Q&A period, but with, I think, a very important question that was, I know, would probably be on everybody's mind about the runaway convention. So I'd like now to turn it over to the audience for any questions you have for the panel. I don't know how the process works here, or who mics. Katie, are you running that? So Katie, go ahead with the first question back there in the back.
Name's Tom Tucker. I'm a geologist. My question is, why wasn't the ratification of the amendments by the states clarified to be that it would be done by the legislators and not by some called convention in each state? Thank you.
I can take a stab at answering that, but I'll just turn it over to the experts here. I don't know if Andy or Mark, if you guys want to jump in.
Is the question about the ratification, you're referring in particular to the last part that says that Congress shall specify the manner of ratification?
Yeah, and see, there's a whole lot of stuff they could do about that.
Sure. So if I understand the question, and obviously correct me if I don't, there are concerns, folks have expressed concerns that there is a role for Congress to play in Article 5, both with respect to calling the convention and specifying the manner in which the convention's proposed amendments are ratified. And I can't do better, I think, than the founders themselves. And there's an entire Federalist paper written by James Madison that addresses this particular topic. And it points out that, in fact, when the states act to call this convention, because all of the legitimacy of the Constitution itself derives from the states, and the states in turn from we the people, Congress has a solemn obligation, right? The founders themselves conceptualize it as an obligation to accord the will of the people. So I suppose it is theoretically possible that Congress could do something to monkey with the process, but it would be just as unlawful as not obeying the terms of Article 5 itself. And so there's all kinds of ways that the states can insulate themselves against that thing, but really at the end of the day, including legal action. But at the end of the day, I think it probably is that you have to hypothesize that there is a grassroots movement that we've already seen where we have millions and millions and millions of people across the country who are clamoring for this constitutional change. And the idea that the people in Congress would stand up against the people and say no is, I think, ill-founded. I mean, in fact, the more likely scenario is what we see in Washington all the time, where the people are clamoring for the change and Congress is unwilling to do it. The idea that they would stop the change when the people demand it, I think, is ill-founded.
It might be instructive to give just a quick, because we're going to want to get through more questions, overview of the history of the amendment process. How many of those have been ratified through the normal legislature process versus a different process?
Yeah, and as far as I know, they've all been done by legislature.
There's actually one,
one.
the repeal of prohibition was done by state ratifying conventions because the legislatures were just too afraid to deal with the issue, so they put it to the people. And I just want to say that, so there's two methods. I think what the questioner is getting to, there's two potential methods for ratification. One is the state legislative method. The other is by some sort of state ratifying conventions. What that looks like is not specified in the Constitution. That's, I think, what you were getting at with your question. I actually, this is going to sound crazy and radical, I'm kind of a fan of state ratifying conventions, and here's why. If you look at the states, they are inherently more conservative than their legislatures. They are certainly more conservative than the federal body legislature. And so I expect that if you get together in state ratifying conventions filled with people, they are going to do more conservative things than their state legislatures would actually do. Again, history shows us that it's unlikely to be state ratifying conventions because legislatures defer to legislatures.
Another question. Katie, can we, right here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Guys, I just want to play devil's advocate for a minute because I'm a big supporter of what you're doing. But two things come to mind. If we had term limits in theory, we would stop judges legislating from the bench. But look at all the trouble John Roberts has gotten us into in just 6 years. Number two, the governor's point about no law can be passed unless Congress approves it. You recall Nancy Pelosi's line about we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. So how do you stop that nonsense, even with constitutional amendments?
Yep, take it.
I'll do the second one first. The Nancy Pelosi did famously say, I believe it was about Obamacare, that she hadn't actually read the Affordable Care Act, so they wanted to pass it so we could all know what was in it. And the short answer is there's really nothing that we can do to stop members of Congress from not doing their jobs, right? The only thing that we can do is instill democratic legitimacy to the result, right? And the democratic legitimacy to the result comes from the fact that at least Nancy Pelosi has to stand for an election, right? At least, admittedly in her own jurisdiction, and Texans don't get to vote for her one way or the other, but her constituents do. And we get to send our constituents to fight with her and to argue with her and to propose their own alternatives. The point of all of this is just to say that no matter what the results of any one of these things, right, if it may not change the result in any particular set of circumstances, but at least we the people get a voice, right? We the people get to have our elected representatives on the record voting for it. And if we don't like it, we have a remedy. It's the ballot box.
And doesn't this underscore, though, the proposal in Governor Abbott's plan to have a backstop of states being able to say, hey, we don't want Obamacare, so if you pass it by whatever the convention would choose, majority, 2/3, 3/4, whatever, states could say no, right? I mean, doesn't that
That's true, too.
underscore that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, Representative Miller.
Yeah, just real quickly, one of the other amendments that we passed at our mock convention was on term limits. That also came from Texas, and what we agreed to as a body was 12 years, either House or Senate. I personally believe that we get a life sentence by federal judges being appointed for life, and so I'm all over that one, okay? And so, but that's important to me. Now, if we send this message to Congress, and my congressman, you never know what might happen next time, okay, but with me. So anyway, you know what I'm saying?
More questions. Mr. Cooper. Katie's got the microphone for you right here.
Thank you. For a few decades, I've been serving in the justice system as a private forensic engineer. For decades before that, I was one of these 1+ million bureaucrats in the executive branch, and then I had almost a decade in the legislative branch at the local level. But that, all of that experience just convinces me that I don't think this nation has any more important thing to do than what these gentlemen were talking about today. And I wish we could record this and require everybody in the nation to hear what these people have said.
Thanks, John.
And my question is the only thing I think you've missed, and that's probably because I missed hearing you tell me. You mentioned the time limit to get it done.
Yes, sir.
What is that time limit?
I'll give you the answer, but we got these great panelists, so you guys jump in.
Sure. So the time limit is determined by the states. That's the short answer. So,
Well-
we get to pick it.
And as a standard course, whether the Congress is the one that sends an amendment to the states for ratification or whether we would go through this process, some amendments have been left without a time limit. In fact, famously, right, we ratified one just in the 90s finally after 190 years or whatever it was.
On congressional pay.
On congressional pay. It had been sitting out there lingering. It had no time limit, no expiration, and it had most of the states, or a good chunk of the states that ratified it. So they finally got it to the number needed in the 90s. Most amendments today, if it's offered through Congress, we haven't had one in a while, would come with an expiration, say a 5-year or 7-year or something like that expiration time. We would suggest probably, but who knows, but a convention, if they called a states and offered amendments, you'd probably put an expiration on it, depending on what the amendment was.
Hey, Chip, I just have to point out as an aside, you've got the gentleman who was responsible for getting that amendment ratified sitting in the room right there. Greg, raise your hand, Greg.
Excellent. All right, more questions. Katie, can we grab somebody back here in the back?
So I understand the need for a convention, especially given what Thomas Jefferson says about healthy rebellion. But I'm wondering about y'all's opinion about the 17th Amendment and the role of the state legislatures in the congressional Senate.
I'll turn over to the panel. You guys want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, this is an opinion. My opinion is, I mean, if I could wave my wand and do one magically, I'd repeal the 17th Amendment. And the reason I say that, for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar, I wasn't until pretty recently, 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of senators by the people of the state. Originally, the way that was set up is the founders intended the senators to actually represent people like Rick, the state government in Washington, D.C. And they had a pretty singular purpose. They needed a really limited vocabulary in Washington, D.C. They were sent to D.C. to say, no. That was pretty much it, right? Because the founders knew that the federal government would usurp their authority. It's just the nature of centralized power. And they wanted people in there who were a body who had a vote in the federal government that could say you're usurping on our authority and you're not allowed to do that. It's hard to imagine a senator who is appointed by the legislature coming home and telling you the great news about the unfunded mandate they just voted for, right? And so I'm a big fan of that. But I want to talk about political reality because I believe in looking at reality. It's an acquired taste, but you got to face it, right? And here's the deal on repealing the 17th Amendment. It's a hard sell because what you're telling the average person is, hey, we would like to take away your vote to your right to vote for your senator. So then you have to explain that. You're already starting on your back foot. I think it's a long haul reach, but I like it.
Now, Senator Hall, do you want to add something? Or, oh. I would only add to that, I think I pretty much co-sponsor what Mark just said. I know I remember Governor Perry had a book called Fed Up. In that book, we talked about both the 16th and 17th Amendments and how those particular amendments at that particular time, really, if you look at it at the start of the really explosion in the progressive state and the long march to a very large federal government, those two amendments are awfully coincidental in time. I'll put it to you that way.
1913, right?
The right to taxation, yeah, exactly. So I do think that Mark's right, but it is a hard slog. But I'll tell you this, if we're successful in this effort, with the Convention of the States, successful in educating a new generation of Americans, understanding that distributed government is at the core of liberty and that our founding fathers understood that, if we're successful in restoring people's belief that the states and local control and closer to the people matters, then things like that might be more sellable.
Agreed.
Right? When people think about it differently and they think about what matters differently, and that's part of what we're trying to do. Another question, Senator Hall, you said you had a question. I don't know if you'd like to put one out. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for doing this. And first I'll say, like my colleague Rick Miller, I also am a veteran. I took the oath of office to defend our country, and I'm in this fight because I am very concerned about the overreach of not just the federal government, but the state government and government in general.
Amen.
And I do indeed want a realistic solution. But I have a lot of people coming through my office on both sides of this issue. And, the concerns are we kidding ourselves with getting some of these changes made? And let me ask the question in all sincerity of looking for an answer so I can answer the people who are coming into my office with these. And it has to do with the basis of what you have said up here is we're in this mess because of the extraordinary decisions that have been made. Now, I don't see anything in what we're doing that will change people making those extraordinary decisions. And it's like Thurgood Marshall said, it's a good thing we have a Constitution, but it's a better thing that it only says what we say it says. And I don't see anything that's going to overcome that. And on the question that you got on the three areas, the physical restraints, term limits, and scope of jurisdiction.
Right.
Physical restraints. We've got a balanced budget amendment here in Texas, but we spend whatever the legislature decides they want to spend because they have the latitude to create smoke and mirrors that allows any budget that they want to be. I mean, that's just the reality of it.
That's right.
Term limits. The bureaucrats and staff members have more influence over laws and regulations than any elected official or any group of elected officials. If all we do is term limit the elected officials, we are boosting the power of the people who actually control the rules and regulations. There are more rules and regulations come out of the executive branch by an order of 1,000 than comes out of Congress. All we're doing is boosting them in that. And the other is scope of jurisdiction. It goes back to we have every branch that has exceeded their scope of jurisdiction. Your annotated Constitution comes out of the judicial side that has created a Constitution that goes beyond their authority to do so. So every branch does it. So writing another piece of paper, adding 3 or 4 pages to what we have in a Constitution, how do we change the human behavior that gets us into this mess in the first place?
I think you'd have to go to the Lord to answer that question effectively.
Yeah.
Senator, I'm going to take a stab for just 1 minute, and then I want to turn it over to these guys to answer a couple things. One, I think, in my opinion, this is the strongest case for the Convention of the States resolution. And that is because you have a combined effort, a coalition of people who are concerned about restraining spending, who are concerned about the possibility that maybe these guys who are there for 50 years are problematic, and then concerned about restraining the federal government vis-a-vis the state. I think that none of these things would be written in stone, right? You have it, you call for a convention, you actually get them in a room, and then they debate these things, and they have a reasonable debate. And look, I think conservatives, you put them in a room, you're going to get a mixed opinion on term limits, right? I've got diehard conservatives who are for it and diehard conservatives who are against it, and they make good arguments on both sides. That's exactly what happened in Philadelphia. You know, these are important issues, and whichever way you go, I'm not sure, in my opinion, side note, it makes a lot of difference. I think you're moving the needle a little bit this way, a little bit this way on term limits. On the balanced budget, you're absolutely right here in Texas. They spend what they want to. My argument would be that if you have some sort of spending restraint, it's at least a club that you can use to bludgeon your representatives with, to say, we said you have to do this. So in Texas, while we're far from perfect, we're far better than Washington. And I think if we had that club in Washington, it would be at least be helpful. Now, look, we all know that they may well end run it by saying, we've got a national emergency. We've got to spend whatever we want. Of course they would try to do that. But at least we've got a bigger tool and a bigger club. And then thirdly, and I think most importantly, is this third prong on restraint. That, to me, is the magic in this deal. That's the stuff, to your point, about how do you actually restrain these guys that Andy alluded to before. We cannot tell Nancy Pelosi what to do. We can't do anything about gerrymandered districts. We can't do anything about how we have our representation up there, and other than fighting day by day. But what we can do is put in some safeguards that empower the states to actually have a voice to say, guys, no. Obamacare, just no, and kill it right in the cradle. Instead of having to have a fight to defund Obamacare in 2013, where you have different opinions about whether you can do it or not, go to your legislatures, call emergency sessions, have governors bring them together, and actually pass resolutions saying, no, we're not going to do this. Now, that's my 2 cents, but I'll now turn it over to this august group.
Yeah, I'd like to, just a couple words. I sit on the Appropriations Committee in the House, and I know exactly what you're talking about, and I agree with you. So how do we fix it? Well, it takes people like you and me Bob, to try to change this, right? I have a real concern about what the role of government really is, federally and state. So what should we be doing? Okay? We need, a lot of things need to change, right, Bob? Right. So what's the alternative, though? What is the alternative? I think the Article 5 is the alternative. It is what we have to do. And send that message. And then if it doesn't work up there with the people we have there, then, Bob, it's up to you and me to think about something else then.
I understand that. I just want, my point was that we need to think beyond just the articles that are changed.
Yes.
Because I'll just pick out one of the three, term limits. I think term limits by themselves would be worse than no term limits at all. Because
you have a total agreement from me. That's why there is a package. That's why I'm not a supporter of a single subject term limits amendment. I'm from California. I know what it means to have term limits in a big legislature.
Yeah, good, okay. Well, that, so long as we look beyond that.
Absolutely.
Through
You're
further
100%
steps,
correct.
that broader scope than just
Yeah.
the short.
And I agree with you, and that's why I threw out the thing on the federal judges. I think there should be some limit there on those people that are appointed for life.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a whole different category,
Yeah.
judges.
Amen. Andy, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
Yeah, just-
And then maybe we have one more, and then we can break.
Very briefly, Senator Hall, thank you for being here. The last part of your original question was, what do we do to change this human impulse to arrogate power? And the founders nailed this 100% correctly. And there is nothing you can do to change the human nature to arrogate power to oneself. All you can do is design a system where ambition is designed to check ambition, right? And so when the founders adjourned in the 1780s, they had created a system of three branches of government that were supposed to be sort of in balance, right? And the states, the fourth article of the United States Constitution, was supposed to keep all of it in check. And we've gotten to the place in this country where the three branches are completely out of whack, and the states are basically treated like political subdivisions of the federal government, which is the exact opposite of what the founders imagined. And so the way I would answer the constituents who come through your door and say, this isn't going to really get at the bottom of the evil of man's heart or the ambition or the arrogation of power, the answer is we have to do a structural system so that we have ambition in every one of these other places to keep the whole system in check. And we have to restore that balance.
And I'd add something even simpler. This is a really simple fight. There's a lot of complicated nuance around it, but this is what the fight is about. There's one question that really matters in American politics today, only one. It's not what should we do. It's not term limits versus balanced budget. It's none of that stuff. The question is who decides.
That's right.
The fight we're having here in Texas is, do Texans decide for Texas, or does Washington, D.C. decide for Texas? So when your constituents come in and they're against this, I would say personally, oh, okay, so then you're in favor of Washington, D.C. continuing to decide for Texas. Because what we're saying is Texas decides for Texas.
Well, I think we're just about near the end. So, look, I appreciate those questions. I really want to thank the panelists here. A couple just concluding thoughts. I think what Mark was just saying is the most salient part. The founders gave us this tool. They gave it to us very specifically. And that when we think about amending the Constitution, and we think about how you go about doing that, and when we're so frustrated with what's going on in Washington, this is the tool that enables the citizens, the people, to be able to take action through their states to amend the Constitution, to structurally put in place the safeguards that they believe after 200 plus years of experience might be needed to amend the Constitution. The founders weren't afraid of amendment, or they wouldn't have given us a tool to do it. And it's not even all that complicated to do it. They just set a high threshold of agreement. That's it, right? You need 3/4 of the states to agree. And so if it's a foolhardy idea, hopefully 13 states will step up and kill it. I believe they will. But that's what this whole process is about, is empowerment of the people through their states. The whole notion of the 10th Amendment, right, is embodying the spirit of the Constitution, which is that it is the states and the people that retain the power that was not specifically given to the federal government. I want to thank somebody I've not mentioned, which is the Lieutenant Governor, for taking significant steps to highlight this issue and putting it among his priorities. His work, along with the governors and those who have made it a priority bill number and a priority for the state of Texas in this legislative session. I want to definitely give a shout out to the Lieutenant Governor for that. I want to thank for Senator Hall for being here. Thank you, sir. I don't know if there's any other electeds Other electeds in the room? Oh, Representative Workman? Thank you, sir. Thank you for your being here. Are there any other electeds in the room? Thank you all for being here. I want to thank this panel. I want to thank Andy for all of his work in the governor's office and what he does, Mark for being out there, and then very importantly and repetitively, I want to thank Representative Miller, Senator Birdwell, who's not here, for their service and for the dedication to the United States and in cause of liberty through this effort. So